Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Please consider saving the lives of the popular wiener dog breed, also known as Dachshunds. One such organization is Dachshund Rescue of Houston. They're an entirely volunteer-based 501c3 organization that rescues and rehomes dogs through their foster network. If you'd like to learn more or to make a donation, visit droh.org. That's DROH.org. And thanks always for listening. Hello, welcome to another episode of Creative Piecemeal Podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi, and today I'm blessed to have author Laura Weymouth. She is a lifelong writer who lives at the edge of the woods in Western New York in a house that may or may not have chicken feet. Ooh, interesting. She's the author of several YA novels, including critically acclaimed The Light Between Worlds, which I absolutely love, read it a few years ago, and the forthcoming A Rush of Wings, a retelling of the classic fairy tale The Wild Swans, scheduled to publish in the fall of 21. So excited to have you on the show, Laura. Hello and welcome.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here.
So for those listeners out there, I sometimes get guests from the Twitter universe, and Laura is an author who I've followed for several years, and I really adore her books and also her tweets, which are endlessly entertaining. So you'll get all her social handles at the end, but we're going to start with who or what inspired you to become an author?
Well, there are a few different things. I would say probably the primary influence would be the work of Lucy Maud Montgomery, because I was just a huge fan of her writing as a small girl. And I read all the Anne of Green Gables books. I read the Emily of New Moon books. I mean, if Lucy Maud Montgomery wrote it, I read it. And then when I was, I think about 12, we took a family vacation to Prince Edward Island, and my mom just carted us around the island to every single Lucy Maud Montgomery related site on Prince Edward Island. And that was a bit boring to me as a 12-year-old, but looking back, it was a really lovely trip. And her work is definitely what made me want to be a writer and want to pursue that same creative outlet of telling stories. And I didn't, at the time, think that I could ever become an author, someone who actually published their work. I just knew that I wanted to do it as a hobby and as something that I did for myself. And even the concept of becoming an author was not something that came in until much later for me.
When did you first really become passionate about that?
Well, I wrote a little bit throughout kindergarten and first grade. And then in second grade, I wrote the short fiction. And I've mentioned it briefly before at events, but it was called A Knight's Lament. And it was about a knight named Sir Peddington who went on a quest to kill a dragon and was mortally wounded in the process, because of course that's what I wrote in second grade, and about how on his deathbed he wished that he had not become a knight and had instead settled down and lived an ordinary life with his childhood sweetheart Ellen. So that was my first work of short fiction as a second grader, and it just sort of snowballed from there, and I really loved it, and I kept doing it, and I wrote Redwall fan fiction and Lord of the Rings fan fiction, and lots and lots of fan fiction. And as well, did create some original work of my own throughout my teens.
That's very nice. Yeah, I also have a fond memory of, writing something when I'm a young child, and, not really realizing I'd come back to writing, later in life, but, you find it and you're like, oh, wow, I can't believe I wrote that,
Oh, I know.
Oh, it's always so interesting.
Yes.
So you have a few books out already, of course, YA fantasy novels, and of course, Rush of Wings is coming soon. But is there anything else on the horizon that you're allowed to talk about, or is it all secret?
Well, it's not all secret because a lot of it is just things that I hope and wish to do in future. So they're just projects that I have in development that aren't under contract that I'd like to see where they take me. And maybe they won't end up going anywhere, but I'm having fun with them at present. So the big one, which I do talk about, is the adult fantasy novel that I've been working on for years and anticipate working on for many more years before anything happens with it. But that's something that I love very much. And it's a project I'm very passionate about and would like to pursue more fully at some point in the future.
Oh, nice. It seems like fantasy is really your wheelhouse and you do so wonderfully at that. But have you ever considered, or even just for fun, thought about writing in other genres?
So my first novel that I ever fully completed at 18, 19 was a YA contemporary. And I have revisited it a little bit lately. And so we'll see what happens with that. That's definitely something that I'm thinking about moving towards, is potentially doing a bit of contemporary.
It's always fun to like stretch our wings, so to speak, as writers and see where it takes us.
Yes, definitely. It's a nice change of pace.
Yes. Is there any genre where you're like, oh no, I'm not going to touch that genre, you know?
Horror, because I'm a huge weenie and I have tried to write a horror short story before, scared myself so badly within 3 paragraphs and was like, you know what, never again. It's just not happening for me.
Maybe that's a sign that it was really good though.
Maybe. And my YA fantasy does tend to skew a little macabre in some sections, but there are some lines where I can't cross it because my imagination is too vivid. I just get to the point where I can't go outside after dark. I'm sleeping with a lamp on. It's a bad situation for me.
Oh no, I feel you. Yes. I also have a vivid imagination. That's why I won't touch horror with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, that's kind of my no-go zone.
Yep. So you had mentioned Lucy Maud Montgomery as one of your favorite authors, but who are some others who've inspired you over the years?
I absolutely love Madeleine L'Engle. She was my go-to author as a teen. She wrote the book that kind of got me through my teen years, which is called The Ring of Endless Light. And I've written about that in a few places online, but her work was really formative for me. Let's see, who else? The Golden Compass and all of his Dark Materials by Philip Pullman is just incredibly brilliant. And the new books he's been coming out with are fantastic. So I'm just so excited that I get to read more in that world. Those were definitely big ones.
Oh yes, those were fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic books. Have you seen the TV show yet?
I've seen a few episodes of it and have not finished it. So I really need to.
Yeah, it's on my list of things to watch, the TV show, but it looks to be a lot more closer to the books.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So we'll have to see how it goes once I get back to it when I'm off deadline.
Right? It sounds like a writer's job is never done.
No, it's if you enjoyed having homework every night at school for several hours after you'd finished your day, you will enjoy being an author.
That's the perfect tagline.
Yes, you will have homework for the rest of your life.
Love homework, be an author.
Exactly.
So speaking of being an author and writing, what is one writing rule that you break and one that you live by?
Oh, I had to think about this one. So one that I definitely break is a lot of, like the pretentious, fusty, white male canon authors say don't use adjectives, which I think is ridiculous. Adjectives serve a purpose. I don't think you should overuse them because all things in moderation, but I am a big fan of a well-placed, judiciously used adjective. And the one that I would say I follow would be, to an extent, again, because moderation in all things, show, don't tell, because it is oftentimes more effective to show your reader, to show your reader in some way what your characters are feeling, what they're going through, as opposed to just telling them, because that removes them from that sensation or from that event. And you want them to experience it firsthand. And again, there are places where that rule should be broken and where it makes sense to do so. But for the most part, I do try to follow that one.
Are there any other writing rules that you used to break, but now you're like, oh, I definitely need to follow this rule?
I don't think so. I've always been a bit odd in how I approach the written word when I was a teenager, and really working on honing my craft. I went through a phase where I was just like fixated on Virginia Woolf and stream of consciousness, but I still loved fantasy. So I wrote most of a novel that was a fantasy novel, and I wrote it as a stream of consciousness piece, and I would write the entire thing on my laptop with the screen whited out so that I could not see what I was writing. And I wrote the entire book that way. So there aren't a whole lot of rules that I've ever wholesale followed.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that in arts and in creative fields, rules are made to be broken.
Right. Yeah. It's always important to take the rules with a grain of salt and just see where your creativity takes you.
Yes. And I think it's important to know some of the rules and conventions of the genre that you're working in so that you can be selective and creative in how you go about breaking them or contravening them. But I do think that for the most part, there's no hard and fast rule that you absolutely should follow 100% of the time.
Except for maybe Oxford comma, right?
I don't know, because I've worked with some publishers who the Oxford comma is part of their style manual and others where it's not. I do think that if you need it for clarity's sake, it should absolutely be there because things can get very confusing without the Oxford comma.
Oh, right. I always love to get authors' opinions on the Oxford comma because I'm a huge fan of the Oxford comma, and it's really hard for me to understand why people don't use it. I mean, I respect their decisions, but it's like I don't get it.
I can take or leave the Oxford comma. I don't have strong feelings about it, but I do have very strong feelings about the color gray, Grey, and the color gray, Gray, being two completely different things. I think there's an entirely different feel and connotation to the two different words. And sometimes they'll correct my Greys to Grays, and it just bothers me.
Yes. I'm also one who spells it Grey, which is the Anglican spelling, I think.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Which it just looks better.
It does.
Paper.
It does. That's how the color gray looks. It has an E.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like you can almost like see the color when you see the word.
Yes, to me, gray with an A is like a non-organic, like steel gray, or a building is gray. Whereas gray with an E is like a gray that you find in nature. The rocks next to the sea are gray. Somebody might have gray eyes. So, but anyway, my copy editors generally are not on board with that.
Oh, that's funny. No, I feel you. I feel you with the spelling there. I find myself, especially a while back, I had written a book where the main character was British, and so I had all of their spellings and mannerisms and things like with British spellings.
Yeah.
And then I got stuck like as a habit writing things that way. Like I'd favorite with a U, and then I'd have to take it out in my own like emails to people because it's like, oh, nobody spells it that way.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Canada and moved to the States when I was 22. So for the first 22 years of my life, all of the spelling was British spelling because Canada uses that system. And then I moved to America and now I have to do American spelling. So I had to completely kind of rework how I spell everything.
Or you could, stick to the old spelling and just be, like cool and hip.
Pretentious.
I guess it depends on how you look at it.
That's true.
It must have been very cold up there. Do you well, now you live in a cold climate still, so I guess
I live just outside of Buffalo, New York, which is like the snow city. And where I live in Canada is less than an hour away from where I live now. So I'm very close to the Canadian border and lived very close to the United States border while growing up in Canada. So climate-wise, where I live now from where I grew up is not very different at all.
Does nature and the outdoors, has that ever inspired you when you were writing?
Oh my goodness, yes, often. My agent sometimes has to take me to task for how many forest descriptions I put in my books, because I would happily write a book that has an incredibly thin plot that just strings together a bunch of different lovely descriptions of nature or old buildings, just lovely things that you might see when you're out and about. But apparently you can't write a book like that and expect it to sell.
Yeah, they sometimes need a little bit of plot in there.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, definitely nature does inspire a lot of what I write.
What is one of the best ways that you've found to break writer's block when you've had that happen to yourself?
Oh, you should have young children. That is absolutely my go-to. Since I had small children and started writing with small children in the house, I have no problems with writer's block because it's either I write now while I can, or it's not going to happen. So there's that kind of sense of desperation and urgency of, well, I need to make it work or it's just not going to occur. So that's my recommendation, is absolutely have some young children or borrow some from somebody, and that will pretty much cure your writer's block.
There you have it, friends.
Yeah.
If you're stuck, go find some kids and babysit.
You can come borrow mine. I will happily lend them to you.
Oh gosh, it's always interesting to see, like, on Twitter when you talk about the funny things they've said, and I'm like, it's almost like those dialogues could go in a book. It's just so creative what they say.
Oh my goodness, I know. There's never a dull moment, and I absolutely adore my kids. When I was growing up, I never planned to become a parent, and then just kind of ended up stumbling into it. And I just think that they hung the moon. They're the greatest thing and so entertaining and my favorite people to be around, even if they are a slight distraction when it comes to sitting down and getting work done.
That is really sweet, though.
They're great. Yeah.
So as a writer, did you ever find yourself like making up bedtime stories for them? And
I have done that in the past. Yes. They mostly like to do read alouds at this point. So we do it every night. We have a read aloud that we're going through. We just finished The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and all watched the movie together. And now we've moved on to Prince Caspian, and we did Jane of Lantern Hill earlier this year, which is a Lucy Maud Montgomery novel. We've done Misty of Chincoteague. We've done Charlotte's Web. So lots and lots of the books that I loved growing up, I'm getting to share with my children now, which is really amazing and special. And I absolutely love that.
Oh, that's very nice.
Yeah, it's wonderful. There's a great sense of satisfaction to be able to say, I loved this book when I was little. Here, I'm going to share it with you, and then have them love it as well.
That is really cool. We're going to sort of flip gears here and get into some really meaty questions.
Ooh.
But I was wondering, did you have any barriers, internal or external, to reaching where you are right now in your career?
Well, I suppose one of the reasons that I didn't pursue becoming an author earlier is that I grew up in like a fairly working class family where no one, by the time my generation came around, had gone to college. In my grandparents' generation, there were teachers and nurses, but then in my parents' generation, neither of my parents had gone to college, and we'd been quite poor when I was a small child, and we were doing fine by the time I was older, but it had just never occurred to me that becoming an author or pursuing a career in the arts of all things was something you could actually do. Writing was always just my weird hobby that I did in my spare time. And when I was in 10th grade, we had a substitute teacher for an extended period of time, for about 2 months, I think. And his name was Mr. Stapley, and he was this very kind of distinguished, gray-haired older gentleman. And I handed in an English assignment to him at one point. And when he gave it back to me, he looked me straight in the eyes and he said, "If you're not published someday, I missed my mark." And it was like a lightning strike to me. No one had ever even suggested that publishing my work was something I could do, or even, conceive of doing. And so this supply teacher, who I might never have met under other circumstances, saying this to me kind of opened that whole concept in my mind of I could potentially publish my work someday. And so from that point on, I worked a fair bit harder at it and continued to hone and refine my craft. And it still wasn't something that I thought you could do as a job, because we didn't know anyone who had jobs in the arts. And then I got older and had my oldest child, who everyone on the internet knows as Sunny. And she was 6 months old. And I was looking down at her and thinking, I would like to show this little girl that as a woman, you can pursue your passions and be a mother, a full-time mother, all at once. And so I started writing decidedly with the goal of eventually getting published. And it took a couple of years, but I then ended up selling The Light Between Worlds and did it sooner than I'd expected to, because I had thought to myself that, eventually I would maybe be writing books once both my children were in school full time. And now here we are in the middle of a pandemic and I'm homeschooling them both and writing books. But that was kind of the road to how I ended up publishing novels.
And, that just goes to show what an impact that teachers can have on the youth,
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah, that my English teachers and the children's librarian at our library growing up, whose name was Jerry Barnum, and who was just one of the warmest and most generous souls, were a huge, huge influence on me. And this children's librarian, Jerry Barnum, would always, have book recommendations for me because I was in all the time and was a voracious reader as a child. And then when I was maybe 13, our library changed locations. And at the new location, she set up a YA section. And we had not had one before. And it was fairly, new conceptually at the time to have a section for YA. And she personally brought me over to this corner of the library that the YA section was in. And she said, "Here, Laura, I have some books for you." And to this day, I don't know if she did it like half with me in mind, because I was constantly there checking things out to read. But it was just like this magical experience of, oh my goodness, look at this. And I think I must have read every single book in that YA corner.
Oh, that's lovely.
So yeah, teachers and librarians just have my utmost respect, because they
of course
essentially turned me into the author that I am today.
Shout out to the teachers and librarians. If you're Absolutely. A teacher or librarian listening, whoa, we love you.
Yes, make the world go round.
They do. Yeah, my dad and mom, I really credit to my love of reading and writing, because my mom always had a book in her hand. It was anything from a cookbook to a romance novel to a classic book to a Reader's Digest, and then my dad would always take us, and he even did it with my nieces and nephews when they were young, to the local library once a week. And I remember when I got my very first library card.
Oh my goodness, yes. What an exciting moment.
Yes.
Yeah, my mom was a big reader as well, and she was the one who was always carting us to the library. And a lot of the read alouds that I share with my kids now, she read aloud to my sister and I when we were small. So it's got that lovely feeling of continuity to it.
You talked a bit about wanting to be able to show your kids that you can be a full-time author and a working mother. And I'm just curious, how do you find that works well for you? Like, do you have to be really careful about your time boundaries, or do you just write whenever? Or, I mean, I know a lot of, I have some friends who also write, but they have kids and they feel guilty for writing instead of paying attention to their children.
That is something that I did not have a particularly hard time with at the beginning, because I have read a lot of studies that show that what you make time for and what you prioritize, you will teach your children is a value. And I think that I could not give my children a better lesson, particularly as small girls, than that it is all right to prioritize and to value the things that you're passionate about and your creative pursuits, and that you can do that while also being available to your family, and that it is all right to set up boundaries within your family, and to be able to say, even as the mom who society would have be universally accessible, to say, okay, this is my time to work on this. You can find other things to do right now, and you can respect the fact that I will be working on this right now. And it does not mean that I don't love you, and it doesn't mean that I'm not available to you. It just means that I am a fully formed person with an identity outside of you, and that I can work to preserve that even while you require a lot of time and attention from me.
Excellent. I feel like you have to say that louder for all the people in the back.
Yeah, I put a lot of thought into that over the years. And
yes.
And it's lovely, because my kids are some of my biggest fans, particularly my oldest Sunny. Anytime I get a box of books from my publisher, she is so excited to watch me open them. She has a collection on her bookshelf of every single edition of every book that I've had come out, even the foreign editions. I've got French and Spanish copies, and she collects them, and she wants one of each. And they're very sweet and supportive, and they like to write on their own now too, because they see me doing it. So the fact that I do it and make time for it also has given them the opportunity to pursue that as a creative outlet.
That's fantastic. And like you said, it's very healthy to have those boundaries, to show that you are a complete person outside of, just being a parent.
Yes, definitely.
I think I don't have kids, but I see so many people I care about in my life sort of lose their identity once they have children, and it's like, oh, I really miss the friend that you were before you had kids. Like, don't lose sight of who you are, you know?
Yeah, it's a difficult kind of act to balance, but you can, I think, to a degree, and the pendulum will swing back and forth. But I think that it's something that you have to strive for, particularly as a woman, because it is very easy to become consumed in that particular pursuit.
That rolls really well into my next question regarding like diversity in the arts. It's really blossomed, I think, in the last year or so, especially during the pandemic, where people are discovering that they have these hidden talents, so to speak, like latent talents. And, suddenly there's people becoming painters, doing music, writing things, and they're saying like, oh, I went back to this book, or I discovered that I can do XYZ creative thing. And there's so much more diversity, which is fantastic. But I really feel like across all the arts, there's always room for growth. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think there's been solid representation, or do you think we could do better?
I think that we've improved over the last few years, but I do think that there's a lot of room to grow yet, like you said, and that we've got a long way to go. And I think that it is important for those of us who have not lacked representation traditionally, like myself, to use their time and resources to make room for people who have lacked representation traditionally. And I think it's important to take stock and say, well, how can I make space? So I think that is a responsibility that I have, and that others like myself have in creative arts.
Very true. As a person I'm an Asian American, and it's interesting because I look back and I didn't really read too many books by Asian authors or Asian American authors growing up. And when I did, it was like old folk tales, it wasn't anything contemporary. So I grew up really lacking seeing that representation.
Yes, and it's so important, and it really, really struck home to me how important that is for people when I discovered in my early 20s a series called The Lumitere Chronicles. And my family is from this small ethno-religious group called Mennonites, and we're, just like kind of live modern lives now, our particular branch of the Mennonites, even though there are old order Mennonites. But my great-grandparents were refugees who came to Canada from Russia in the wake of the Russian Civil War. And so I grew up with a lot of traumatic and really kind of horrifying family stories of what that time had been like, and about people being dragged off to work camps in Siberia, being taken just on forced marches and, dying in Russia. And it really marked who I was as a child. And I read this series called The Lumitere Chronicles, which is essentially about the refugee experience told through a fantasy lens. And it just hit home for me in such an incredibly deep way. And it was the first time that I felt like I'd ever seen that aspect of my family history and those stories portrayed in books. And to this day, it's my most favorite fantasy trilogy, and it's extremely important to me. And that definitely was a watershed moment for me in realizing how incredibly important it is that we do diversify the arts, so that all young people, all people across the board, are able to see themselves and their experiences reflected in fiction and music and artwork, because there is such a powerful force, to be able to see that someone else understands, and that you've been seen and known, and that your experiences are not limited to just you, that they're part of the broader human experience.
And that must have been so enlightening and in such an intense moment when you read those books.
Oh my goodness, yes, I just sobbed through them. And now I recommend them to everyone constantly, even though I know that they won't have the same experience with them that I did, but they're a good read.
That's good. I'll have to add that to my list. I used to consider myself well read, but as there's so many books now, and it's like, I can never keep up.
Oh my goodness, I know. And I tend to skew a bit older in my taste. So I read a lot of older things that have been out for a few years. There's no way I'm ever going to keep up with everything that's coming out, as it comes out.
Which is a good thing, I guess. I'd rather have too many books to read than not enough.
Oh, absolutely. What an excellent problem to have.
Yes. If you could do any other creative art besides writing, what do you think that would be?
Well, I have to learn how to do it, or can I be spontaneously good at it?
we could pretend that you wake up and you could do any other creative art perfectly.
I would love to be able to paint or do any sort of visual art. I'm not remotely gifted in that area. And some of the authors who I follow just seem like they have creative talent, oozing out of their pores. My friend Hannah Alcaf is also an incredible artist, and just lots and lots of talent in so many authors for doing other things. And as close as I can come to visual art is gardening, because I don't have the skill or the innate talent. I suppose I could work on it and become a little better at it, but I just don't have what it takes to become a really adept visual artist. So if I could pursue anything else and actually have the talent for it, that would be the thing.
Yeah. Well, that sounds fun. Although I must say gardening is difficult all on its own. So that's great. You're good at it.
Well, I'm competent at it. I don't know about good at it.
But that's nice. Do you ever get ideas while you're gardening?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, because it's a very kind of meditative process. Not a lot of, I guess, higher brain thinking is going on while you're gardening. You're just pulling weeds, digging holes, sticking things in the holes, turning a hose on the plant that needs it. So a lot of, noodling around thinking about plot stuff happens in my brain while I garden, which is very helpful.
And speaking of plot stuff, are you a plotter or a pantser or a plantser?
I am a reformed pantser. I started out as a pantser, but as I mentioned in regards to writer's block, I have these children that mean that I really, really have to maximize any kind of work time that I have. So I am now a planner. I do tend to write like an 8 to 9 page synopsis of the entire book before I start working on the book. And that's how I do things now. And I kind of workshop the synopsis with my agent before the book goes beyond like the first act, because it saves me a ton of time on the revision end where I don't have to rewrite the whole book. I can fix any plot problems in the synopsis before it's written, which is very efficient. And that is something I need in my life right now.
That's good for efficiency then.
Yeah, it works out very well.
Did it feel like torture having to go and become a reformed pantser?
No, it actually was something I sort of did through necessity, because my second novel, A Treason of Thorns, I sort of pantsed my way through as well in the initial stages, which led to a really, really grueling couple of rounds of revisions that were hard to get through. I was rewriting so much, and I sort of just said, never again. I will not do this again. We're going to figure out the plot in advance and nail that down so that I won't have to do this.
And any tips for people out there in the world who pants their way through writing and need to be reformed?
Well, I think generally speaking, even if you are a pantser, you have an idea of what the big watershed moments of the book are going to be. Like, I don't know many pantsers who go into it and get very far into the book without knowing sort of the ending that they're heading for. So I think if you know the big watershed moments and just have an idea of a few scenes that you want to put in, you can use them sort of as like tent pegs, and you can build up the rest of the book around those. That's generally what I do. I start with like a very bare bones outline, and then I build the synopsis from that.
That seems like a really good idea.
Yeah, it works well for the pantser brain. Baby steps.
That's right, baby steps. I realize this would probably be very difficult, but do you have a favorite of your own books?
Just to be fair to the published ones, I'll say my adult fantasy that I never finish and always talk about. So I'll be 83 and doing interviews and saying it's my adult fantasy that I've never published. But that one at present, I just think it has a huge amount of potential. So
Yeah. Well,
and that
there
way I
you
don't
go.
have to pick between my published books.
There you go. There you go. A very diplomatic answer.
Yes. Yeah.
So, if you could be any fictional character, who would you be?
That's really tough because a lot of fictional characters go through some really horrible experiences. So I thought about this and I think I would choose Anne of Green Gables because she has a lovely life. She spends her time on Prince Edward Island, in beautiful nature, surrounded by people who love her. She ends up having a relatively ordinary adult existence, settles down with her childhood sweetheart. Nobody complained that was a spoiler. You've had a lot of time to read the books.
Dang it!
Yes, but no, that would definitely, I think, be my choice. I'd pick Anne of Green Gables.
Oh, that's nice. That's true. A lot of characters really go through a lot that no one really would want to go through in life.
Yes, definitely. Even when those memes go around where it's like, choose your fantasy world that you'd like to visit. A lot of them are like, no, I want to read about it. I don't want to go there. That's horrible.
Right?
Yeah.
Very true. Very true. How has your life in the creative arts been different than you imagined?
There have been a lot more ups and downs than I imagined. I expected that once I managed to sort of break into publishing, that it would be, relatively just plateau and kind of just, I'd chug along doing my thing. But there have been a lot more ups and downs than I thought there would be. It's, never a sure thing. I switched publishers at one point. I did not end up publishing a book last year at all, which actually worked out extremely well because I would not have chosen to publish a book in the middle of the pandemic and feel very deeply for those who were in the position of doing so, especially debuts. But yeah, there's just been a lot more ups and downs than I expected that there would be, which is good and keeps life interesting.
Do you feel that the pandemic has affected your creative process at all, like for good or bad or just sort of neutral?
I would not say that my actual creative process itself has necessarily been affected, in that I have already been forced for the past few years to be very efficient in how I use my time. But I would say that it has affected where I would likely be at this point in my publishing career, in that 2020 was supposed to be the year when both my children were in school full time. And so I had planned to branch out and potentially publish 2 books during 2021 and was not able to because I've been homeschooling. So,
do you think people will ever go back to book launches and book tours and things like that?
I hope so, because I really, really love getting to travel for work and to meet readers. That's definitely one of the highlights of being an author for me. And it's not really the same at a virtual event. I do enjoy it, especially when I do ones where, they have the live chat option and I can see people being excited in the little side margin and having a great time. But there's just no substitute for the experience of getting to go to a bookstore and to meet readers in person and, be able to hear from them a bit of their stories and, meet people who I may have interacted with on Twitter, which is always wonderful and a huge treat for me. So I really hope that we will get back to that.
Yes, I can imagine that's probably definitely a highlight of, being a writer, is being able to meet your fans in person.
It is. I've met so many amazing readers and independent booksellers and librarians and teachers, and it's just been fantastic.
Is there any place that you have not yet traveled for book reasons that you would love to go?
Not that I can think of. I've been really, really lucky in that I was able to go to California for the first time to do some book events there. I'd never visited the state before, and it's beautiful. I've been able to go to Phoenix and Arizona for some book events with my friend Joanna Meyer. And that was really nice. I've gone to New York. So I've been to Atlanta to a beautiful bookstore there called The Story Shop, which if anybody gets a chance to visit there, they have a wardrobe that you can walk through like you're going to Narnia. And that's where they do their children's story time. There's a room behind it. And they have this amazing banquet table that they set up for parties. And they'll do like Alice in Wonderland banquets, or they'll do Harry Potter banquets. And the decor is just incredible. And they have a little Harry Potter room. They have a little hobbit hole that children can go in. And there's a book nook behind it where they can read. So if you get a chance to visit the Story Shop in Atlanta, you absolutely should.
Oh, that sounds precious.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Wow. All right. I'm booking a ticket to Atlanta.
There we go.
You're never too old for the children's section of the bookstores.
No, never. That's where I go first thing every time.
They have such cute books, and then they have like the little stuffed animal characters that go with the books. And
I love it. And I am in awe of picture book authors. I have tried to write picture books, and I just don't think that I have, that kind of brevity within me to be able to write a picture book really well. But just authors who are able to write a beautiful or funny or poignant or heartfelt story within the span of so few words just have my, everlasting respect. It's incredible.
I think just writing in general is hard.
It is. It definitely is. A lot of thought that has to go into it.
Very true. What is a favorite memory or a funny story from your time working on your books?
We do have these guinea pigs right now. We adopted these guinea pigs. We had to rehome our flock of chickens due to the neighborhood that we live in. And I had the brilliant idea of adopting a pair of guinea pigs for the girls to soften the blow of rehoming the chickens. These guinea pigs are the most demanding creatures I have ever met in my entire life. And they are in the room where I sit to work. So every time I walk into the room to do my work, they make this horrible squeaking noise at me because they want a treat. And one of them in particular will take his water bottle. He will smash it against the bars of the cage like a horrible bar patron pounding a glass on the counter. And usually there's water in there. But anyway, so generally speaking, as I'm writing, I'm being harassed by a pair of guinea pigs. You can envision me sitting there with a couple of oversized rodents hounding me while I write my books.
Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Well, if that doesn't make you an efficient writer, I don't know what will.
I know.
Oh my goodness. Yes, between the guinea pigs, a publishing deadline, and 2 adorable children, I bet you fly through those words.
I certainly do.
Oh gosh, that's definitely what to do. If you're on a deadline, get some cute furry pets, find some children.
Yes, I can provide you with all of them.
And what would you do with an empty house?
Oh, I'd be so bored. I wouldn't know what to do with myself.
I'm very curious about this one. What is a common myth about the field of writing and or publishing? And do you think that myth or stereotype will eventually go away?
I would say the biggest one for people who are like unrelated to the publishing industry in any way is that writers are rich and famous, because we are incredibly not rich and famous. I cannot stress enough how not rich and famous we are. None of that going on either count over here. So I did a school visit back to my high school that I had gone to, and one of the kids immediately put his hand up and asked me if I consider myself to be famous. And I just started laughing maniacally because no, I'm not at all. And so that's a big one, is that people assume that you're rich and famous and that a movie is imminently about to be made of your books. And I don't think that that's necessarily ever going to go away, because I think that just the actual business end of publishing is something that is a huge mystery to people who are outside of it. So I think it will continue to be something that we have to tell people is not actually true.
It would seem that people get into writing and publishing not for the fame and the riches, but really because they want to share their art. And the myth is definitely there, though.
Yes, and if you do try to get into it in order to be rich and famous, it's going to go very badly for you. So I don't recommend that.
It's interesting about how, especially the young persons, when people come for career day or things like that, that's what they think. Like they think, oh, you're a published author, or you're in movies, or you're in some sort of entertainment field and you have a modicum of success. So therefore you must be rich and famous. And I think it's almost a disservice to the young people that they don't realize that it takes so much hard work, and you have to have such a passion for the arts to even make an everyday living.
Yes, at least during the Victorian era, they had this stereotype of the starving poet living in an attic. So, which is definitely a more realistic view of what it's like to work in the arts for the most part.
Although we're not always all living in attics.
No, some of us also live in basements.
Exactly. Shake it up a little.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, before we go, I was wondering, in your own words, what does living a creative life mean to you?
I would say that living a creative life means doing so beyond the bounds of just the creative discipline that you've decided to pursue professionally. So it means, choosing to incorporate creative endeavors elsewhere as well. I do a lot of baking, I do a lot of cooking, I do a lot of gardening again. And I think it means allowing yourself room to try things that you won't necessarily be good at and that you might fail at. I think allowing yourself room for failure and to grow in the things that you pursue is really key to living a creative life, because nobody is ever going to undertake any sort of creative discipline if they're hampered by fear of failure, because we are all going to fail at some point or other. And you have to leave yourself room to grow and to develop at any particular skill. So I think that's the key right there, is not being afraid to fail at something initially or to not be good at it.
Excellent words to live by, for sure. So listeners, if you have enjoyed the podcast, be sure to check the links in the show notes to learn more about author Laura Weymouth and where to buy her books. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I had a really great time.
Excellent. All right, listeners, have a good one. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.